On the evening of November 27, 2009, Michael Miller, or Big Mike as pretty much everyone knew him, was stomping around his property in Webster Plantation, Maine, studying his double-wide trailer and thinking through the new addition he was planning. Like his nickname suggested, 47-year-old Big Mike was a huge man, and he had a big bushy beard, and he looked right at home in this desolate rural setting. The trailer stood at the center of a snowy clearing along the edge of dark woods. There were no other buildings in sight, since Big Mike's closest neighbor lived almost 20 miles away. His hometown of Webster Plantation wasn't really a town at all. It had a population of 85 people, a one-room town hall, 2 roads, and no streetlights. There had never really been much to do there, aside from, creek fishing and taking in the nature, and for a lot of people, working at the local lumber mill. Big Mike had been a seasonal employee there for 29 years, but just 1 week ago, he'd been laid off. The loss of his job had stung, but he wasn't too worried. He and his wife Val lived frugally, and so they had enough cash stowed away to get by until he found another job. Big Mike was just about to head back inside when he heard a vehicle approaching. He turned to see a pair of headlights sweep through the trees. Then a familiar white Ford Explorer came into view and pulled up to his mobile home. It was his 2 sons, 27-year-old Mike Jr. and 26-year-old Matt. Mike Jr., the oldest son, was like a smaller, clean-shaven version of Big Mike. But Matt was a lot different. He was skinny and pale, with a buzz cut and tattoos along his neck. Matt also had heavy shadows under his eyes, like he hadn't been sleeping well. Big Mike had not expected to see his kids tonight, but was happy for the visit. So he walked up and gave them each a big hug and invited them inside. Then he called out to Val that the boys had stopped by for a visit, and within seconds, his wife appeared from the kitchen with a tin of her famous coffee cakes in hand. At 47 years old, Val was a very energetic and petite woman who looked even smaller standing next to her hulking husband. The family snacked and caught up, and then Val reminded everyone that they had a birthday tomorrow. Matt's baby daughter was turning 1. However, Matt still had not told anyone what the party plans were. Matt said they weren't really planning on doing anything, which Val immediately insisted was ridiculous. She said if Matt didn't want to plan something, well, she and Big Mike would be more than happy to host the party at their place. Matt tried to dissuade her, but finally just caved and agreed to let her host the party as long as it was small. Just immediate family, along with Mike Jr., Matt's girlfriend, as well as Mike Jr.'s best friend, Nate. The 3 of them were practically family anyway. Then Matt excused himself and asked if Big Mike could step outside for a moment. Big Mike's jaw instantly tensed. He could guess where this was heading. And sure enough, the moment they were outside together, Matt asked his father if he could borrow some money. Matt began talking about how he hadn't worked in months and was struggling with all the costs of a new baby. He couldn't even afford gifts or a cake for tomorrow. That's why they hadn't planned a party. When he finally finished his spiel, Big Mike told Matt not to worry about the cake. He and Val would be happy to pick one up before the party. But he couldn't lend Matt money at the moment. For one thing, Big Mike told his younger son that he'd himself just been laid off from his job at the mill, so money was tight for him. And more importantly, he couldn't trust that Matt would actually use the money for his family. Matt looked absolutely furious at his father's response, but he did not push the issue. He just shook his head and headed back into the mobile home, where he asked if Mike Jr. was ready to go. The boys left a few minutes later, giving Val a kiss on the cheek before climbing into Matt's Ford Explorer. Big Mike watched the SUV disappear into the forest, wondering if he had been too hard on Matt. Then he heard Val calling, and he turned to head back inside. Around 12:40 p.m. the next day, so Saturday, November 28th, another car pulled up outside of Big Mike and Val's mobile home. The driver climbed out, grabbed a red plastic gas can from the back seat, and started trudging through the snow toward the trailer. The driver's name was Alan Richardson, and he was a neighbor and friend of Big Mike and Val's. Alan had borrowed the gas can from Big Mike a few days earlier, and he was here now to return it. However, when he reached the trailer and knocked on the door, no one responded. Alan tried the door handle and found it was locked. Now, normally, Alan would have assumed that the Millers had just left to run an errand, but he looked and saw both of their vehicles were parked nearby. So he tried knocking again, and when he got no response again, he moved to the nearest window and peered inside. Tilting his head, he was able to make out what appeared to be homemade birthday decorations taped to one wall. There were also paper plates and a few liters of soda sitting out on the counter. It looked like Big Mike and Val were getting ready for a party. But just then, he noticed something disturbing on the kitchen floor. It took him a moment to realize what he was even looking at, but once he did, he nearly fell over backward. Because Big Mike and Val were both sprawled on the floor beside each other, not moving. Once Alan got over the initial shock, he rapped on the glass and called out to them, but they didn't move at all. Alan's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and punched in 911. The moment the dispatcher picked up, Alan told them he'd just discovered the Millers unconscious in their trailer with the door locked. He asked if he should break in and try to help them, but the dispatcher told him that could be dangerous. Whatever caused the Millers to collapse could still be in there, whether it was an electrical problem or a carbon monoxide leak or something else. And so the dispatcher instructed Alan to simply wait until the authorities arrived, which unfortunately would take a while since the nearest police station was over 30 miles away. Alan was still waiting nervously outside the mobile home when he heard sirens approaching through the woods. An ambulance rounded a bend in the trees, followed by a police cruiser and a fire engine, and they all pulled up in front of Alan, lights flashing. A police officer wearing a respirator mask told Alan to stand aside, and everyone waited while the firefighters tested the air around the door for carbon monoxide. When they announced that the coast was clear, the police forced open the door and entered the mobile home, followed by a pair of EMTs. And what they found, there in the kitchen, was Big Mike lying flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling, with his legs folded awkwardly beneath him. His wife Val was slumped by his side, with her head resting on his chest. Their skin was waxy and pale, they weren't breathing, and there was a small amount of blood on the floor around them. The EMTs checked for a pulse to be certain, but it was obvious the Millers were dead. And as soon as the EMTs looked more closely, it became clear what killed the Millers, and it was not carbon monoxide. They noticed a small hole in Val's right temple, and a similar one at the base of Big Mike's skull. The Millers had been shot. Meanwhile, Alan continued to wait outside, watching the activity from a distance and calling everyone he knew to tell them about his awful discovery. At the same time, local police and medical personnel continued to arrive one by one until an entire fleet of law enforcement vehicles filled the clearing. Finally, about a half an hour after the EMTs first entered the mobile home, lead investigators Daryl Peary and Brian Strout of the Maine State Police arrived. The detectives stepped out of their car, quickly introduced themselves to Alan, and then said they had a few questions for him. They wanted to know how Alan knew the Millers and why he was visiting that morning. He told them about borrowing the gas can and said that Big Mike and Val were some of his favorite neighbors, as good-natured and helpful as you could find. He also mentioned that he'd been surprised to find the door locked when he arrived. People around here typically left their doors unlocked. The detectives collected Alan's contact information and then told him he could leave. After that, they headed inside. Detective Peary's first thought upon entering the mobile home was just how neat everything was. When he got the call for 2 potential deaths at a trailer in the woods, he'd sort of half expected the place to be a cluttered mess, possibly even a drug den or meth lab. Instead, he found a tidy living room full of family photos and birthday decorations. This was a well-cared-for home, a very crowded home at the moment, since police officers were still busy photographing everything in sight. The detectives slipped through the crowd and made their way to the kitchen, where they found the medical examiner crouching over the Millers. Detective Strout leaned down close to examine the bullet hole in Val's right temple. As he did, Peary commented that there wasn't a lot of blood in the kitchen for a pair of gunshot wounds, and the medical examiner agreed, explaining that the murder weapon had to be a small, underpowered handgun like a .22. The detectives perked up when they heard this, because they knew such a small gun like a .22 would most likely be used at very close range, and if Big Mike was shot up close from behind, it suggested one of two things. Either he had been held at gunpoint and executed, or he knew his killer and trusted them well enough to invite them into his kitchen and then turn his back on them. Just as they were figuring out which was more likely, A police officer hurried over and said they'd just found something the detectives would want to see. Strout and Peary followed this officer to a small room that was full of shelves. They were stocked floor to ceiling with used electronics, stacks of DVDs, tools, and a small arsenal of firearms. Strout and Perry began walking through the room, pulling out random bins to check on the contents. They couldn't imagine what all this merchandise was doing here. But before they could figure it out, there was a commotion outside. The detectives went back to the living room and looked out the window at a young man in his late 20s flailing his arms in frustration while a sheriff's deputy blocked him from entering the front door. The man kept repeating that he needed to see his mother and father, until finally the deputy just said, "I'm sorry, Mike, they're gone." At that point, the young man began to sob. Then he stumbled back to his truck, which was parked alongside all the other law enforcement vehicles. By the time the detectives reached the man, he was sitting in the driver's seat with the door open, repeatedly trying to call someone on his cell phone. Strout and Peary introduced themselves to the young man, who replied that he was Mike Jr., the Millers' oldest son. They asked him why he had come to his parents' place, and he explained that he just heard from a friend that there was some kind of an accident at his mom and dad's place. And so he had rushed over as fast as he could, but he'd never expected to learn that both of his parents were dead. Mike Jr. said he had spent the last few minutes desperately trying to call his younger brother, Matt. Mike wanted to be the one to break the news before Matt heard it from someone else. But unfortunately, Matt wasn't picking up. Now, Mike Jr. set his phone aside and turned to Strout and Peary. He had the look of a man who was in shock. But he said he wanted to help and then offered to tell them anything they wanted to know. The detectives asked him if there was any reason he could think of that somebody might want to hurt his parents. Mike Jr. said what most people say in this situation right after they lose a loved one. He said his parents were great people and everybody loved them. However, as he said this, a worried look came across his face, and he told the detectives that while his dad had worked at the mill, whenever times got tough, he would supplement his income with a lucrative side hustle, operating a pawn shop and loan shark business right out of his mobile home. He said his father also bought and sold prescription narcotics. The whole operation was unlicensed and totally illegal, but this far from civilization, most people didn't care. Big Mike had a long list of regular customers who would often stop by out of the blue. This information cast the murders in a whole new light for the detectives. Big Mike and Val weren't just some respected couple mysteriously gunned down in their family home. They were the owners of a shady, illegal business that very likely could have turned their trailer into a revolving door of unsavory characters. And the detectives figured Big Mike must have had large amounts of cash on hand to run his loan business. Maybe a desperate individual who did business with Mike saw him as an easy target. Detective Strout was now itching to get back inside the mobile home and verify whether anything was missing. But first, he asked Mike Jr. when he last heard from his parents. Mike Jr. said he'd spoken to his mother around 10 a.m. that morning to firm up details for his niece's birthday party, which Big Mike and Val were supposed to host that afternoon at their mobile home. Mike also said it sounded like his parents weren't alone because when he spoke to her, he heard people talking in the background. And he actually recognized one of the voices as his cousin, a man who was named Clayton Giddon. The detectives made a note that Clayton Giddon could have been the last person to see the Millers alive. After they wrapped up with Mike Jr., Detective Strout called the state police headquarters to try to get background information on Clayton. At the same time, Peary went back inside the trailer. He wanted to get a second look at the storage room where Big Mike had been running his business. And when he got back there and looked around at the cluttered space, it was impossible to say for sure whether anything had been taken. That is, until Peary found an orderly stack of ledgers on a shelf. Flipping through these pages, it quickly became clear that Big Mike had kept meticulous records. Everything he'd bought or sold and every dime he lent was marked and dated. And from the information on these records, Peary could see that a safe where Mike stored jewelry and other high-value items was clearly missing. He also couldn't find one ledger book from the set, which looked like it was the one that was used to track Big Mike's loans. And so Peary was thinking more than ever that robbery had to be the motive for the murders when his partner, Detective Strout, came in to join him. Strout said he had just spoken to the office, who had given him an address for Clayton Giddon, Mike Jr.'s cousin. He was located in the nearby tiny town of Springfield. Strout told his partner that Clayton was apparently an avid hunter, which meant he very likely owned a lot of guns. Now, both detectives were even more eager to talk to him. Later that afternoon, when Strout and Peary knocked on Clayton's door, a young girl answered. She ran to get her father and returned moments later with a man in his mid-30s. Clayton was clearly shaken up, as though he'd already heard the news about his aunt and uncle's deaths. However, when the detectives told him that Big Mike and Val were murdered, Clayton seemed startled. And then he became even more distraught when he realized he was a potential suspect. But Detective Peary promised Clayton they were only there to talk. So Clayton took a few calming breaths, then he invited them into the living room. Clayton told the detectives that he'd driven out to have coffee with his aunt and uncle that morning, and he'd taken his 9-year-old daughter with him. When they arrived at their mobile home around 10 a.m., Big Mike and Val were at ease and looking forward to the birthday party later that day. There was no sign of any trouble, and the couple did not seem like they were in danger. Detective Strout listened patiently, while at the same time studying the man for any sign that he might be lying. But Clayton seemed genuinely shocked. And if his daughter really had been there that morning, Strout had a hard time believing that Clayton was the killer. After all, who could commit murder in front of their own child? But suddenly, Clayton said something that made both detectives lean forward in their seats. He told them that he and his daughter were not the only ones at the Miller's place that morning. When they arrived, Big Mike and Val were already chatting with a young man named Nate Nightingale. Clayton didn't know exactly why Nate was there or what he was doing, but he said he didn't find it that unusual. Nate was Mike Jr.'s best friend, and he hung around the Miller's place all the time. But Clayton said the detectives should still talk to him, because when Clayton left the trailer at 10:30 a.m., Nate was still there. Hearing this, Strout and Peary could both feel the case starting to pick up speed. The Millers had been dead for only a matter of hours, but already the detectives had a potential witness who might have been in the room when the murders happened. When the detectives met at the state police office the following day, November 29th, they found new information waiting for them. The autopsy results had come in, and they confirmed that Big Mike and Val were killed with a .22 caliber pistol. This cemented the detectives' suspicions that they'd both been shot at close range, likely right there in their kitchen. The office had also pulled Big Mike's phone records, showing that he'd called a friend at 10:40 a.m. The detectives would contact this friend, and they would confirm that yep, Big Mike had called them, and during their conversation, nothing had seemed off. That left a narrow 2-hour window when Big Mike and Val could have been shot. Big Mike was very much alive at 10:40 a.m., but the couple was dead by 12:44 p.m. when Alan Richardson, the neighbor, had called 911. So Strout and Peary got to work tracking down Nate Nightingale, perhaps the last known person to see the victims alive. But they were also eager to speak with Matt Miller, the younger son of Big Mike and Val, who still was not answering his phone. And as they would find out, Nate Nightingale and Matt lived right near each other. So the detectives set out to pay them each a visit. Matt's apartment was closer to the station, so Strout and Peary headed there first. And from the moment Matt answered the door, the detectives could sense that something was just off. The 26-year-old had shadows under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. But it was actually Matt's behavior, not his appearance, that really got their attention. Matt was not acting like someone who just lost his parents. He didn't show signs of grief or even press the detectives for any details on the progress of the case. Instead, he seemed nervous and evasive, almost like he just wanted Strout and Peary to leave as soon as possible. And the detectives responded to this behavior by actually pressing him on his whereabouts the previous day. He told them he had just been driving around Lincoln with his girlfriend Tanya and their infant daughter, picking up last-minute items for the birthday party that afternoon. Matt's alibi was short on details, and the way Matt refused to meet their eyes as he spoke made the detectives even more suspicious. And also, Tanya was out running errands with the baby, so she couldn't even confirm Matt's story. Strout felt sure that Matt must be hiding something. So he tried asking about his relationship with Big Mike and Val. Was he on good terms with his parents? Matt brushed the question off, saying of course he was on fine terms with them. They were his parents. And then after that, no matter what the detectives asked, Matt gave similarly curt responses. It eventually became clear the detectives were not going to get much more from him today. So they got a cell phone number for Matt's girlfriend, Tanya, and told him they'd follow up soon. And then they left to go talk to the next person on their list, Nate Nightingale. After their interview with Matt, speaking to Nate was like a breath of fresh air. From the moment Nate answered the door, he was polite and eager to help. Nate was clearly upset and told the detectives that he'd been close to the Millers for years. He had been best friends with Mike Jr. since high school, and he considered the Millers' trailer like his second home. Detective Peary asked Nate what he had been doing at the Millers' trailer on the morning of their murders. Nate said that he dropped by to catch up and also to take out a small loan from Big Mike. They'd just wrapped up business when Big Mike's nephew, Clayton Giddon, had arrived with his daughter. Nate said that Clayton left at 10:30, and then Big Mike took a phone call shortly after that. And then after Mike got off the phone, Nate said his goodbyes. To this point, Nate's story about what happened that morning matched all the details the detectives already knew from speaking to Clayton and also looking over Big Mike's phone records. But then, Nate revealed something they had not expected. Nate said that as he was leaving, a woman arrived at the Millers' trailer. He said he'd never seen her before, but she looked like she was in her 50s, maybe around 5'4" tall, with a slender build and glasses and bangs. He said she had called out, "Hi, Val," as she entered the mobile home, and she greeted Nate as he was leaving. His best guess was that she was a customer, but she could have just been a friend. At that point, Nate said he drove off to meet up with his girlfriend, so he didn't know how long that woman had stayed at the trailer. The detectives got the feeling like things were speeding up again. They now had someone who was at the trailer during the 2-hour window when the shooting occurred. The detectives knew they had to speak to this woman, but they had to find her first. Strout and Peary told Nate that a department sketch artist would be in touch very soon to put together a sketch of this mysterious woman. And sure enough, by the time the two detectives were back at the office, they found that the artist and Nate had already linked up, and the sketch was complete. Looking at the sketch, the detectives thought this woman looked like she could be anyone. But there weren't a lot of people in this part of Maine to begin with, so if this woman was a local, there was a decent chance somebody would recognize her. On December 1st, 2009, so 3 days after the Millers' murder, the detectives hosted a press conference where they officially disclosed what many people already knew. The Millers' deaths had been ruled a double homicide. Then, they also released the forensic sketch of the mystery woman, saying she was an important person of interest in the case. Anyone who recognized her was encouraged to call the investigators as soon as possible. Right after the press conference, police posted copies of the sketch all over town, while others went door to door asking if anyone knew the woman. And soon, calls started to come from people all around the state who said they did recognize her. The detectives were just starting to look into these tips when Matt Miller's girlfriend, Tanya, finally returned their call from 2 days ago. They asked her where Matt had been on the morning of the murders, wondering if she would confirm Matt's claim that she'd spent the morning driving around with him looking for gifts. But instead, Tanya insisted she had not been with Matt at all that morning. She said on Saturday morning, Matt had walked out the door without saying where he was going. And for the next 2 hours, nobody could reach him, which was extremely frustrating considering they were supposed to be getting ready for their daughter's birthday party that afternoon. She said he finally returned around noon, but refused to say where he'd been. The detectives were astonished. Matt had clearly lied to them, and his own girlfriend was now saying that she herself didn't know where Matt was during the time of the murders. They considered driving over to pick Matt up for questioning, but decided to hold off until they could gather more information. The detectives already knew Matt had a criminal record. There was an outstanding arrest warrant out for him for writing bad checks. But now, Strout and Peary wondered if he might be involved in more illegal activity. For the next 3 days, the detectives quietly contacted people throughout the area, pressing for information about Matt. And what they learned was that Matt was clearly addicted to prescription drugs and had recently begun selling personal items, including his own Xbox, so he could buy more. And Matt's older brother, Mike Jr., had told them that Matt had asked his father for a loan on the night before the murders, when the brothers had dropped by. Big Mike had apparently turned him down, most likely because he knew Matt would simply blow the money on drugs. But the most damning tip of all didn't have anything to do with Matt's addiction or his criminal past. A local resident told the detectives they'd seen Matt's white Ford Explorer in the vicinity of his parents' house on the morning of the murders. This was something Matt had never disclosed to the police, and it potentially put him at the scene during the 2-hour window when Big Mike and Val were murdered. At this point, Strout and Peary knew it was time to talk to Matt again. They were not quite ready to charge him with his parents' murders, but the facts were quickly stacking up against him. So on December 3rd, 5 days after the murders, they arrested Matt on that outstanding bounced check charge and brought him in for questioning. Once they put him in a room, they pushed him hard, telling him they knew he killed his parents. And Matt just denied everything, while at the same time becoming increasingly emotional. But after hours of intense interrogation, Matt stuck to his story that he never would hurt his parents, and even the detectives started to wonder if they had it wrong. So they ultimately sent Matt back to a holding cell and then stepped out of the interview room to regroup. And that's when they got a tip that reassured them they were on the right track. A local man called to say that on the evening before Big Mike and Val were killed, Matt had called him up looking to buy a gun. He even specified he wanted a .22 caliber pistol, which, according to the autopsy, was the type of gun used to commit the murders. The man said the firearms sale had not gone through, but the detectives figured Matt still could have kept on looking and eventually gotten his hands on a .22. With this new tip, the detectives marched back into the holding cell where Matt sat on his bed and told him what they'd learned. Matt immediately insisted that the tip was false, saying he never tried to buy a gun that night. But the stress of the interrogation was clearly wearing on him, and finally he broke down and confessed. Not to murdering his parents, but to lying about his alibi. He said that on the morning of the murders, he was meeting with a drug dealer not far from his parents' place. He bought some pills and then went into the woods to take them. He later lied about it because he didn't want to incriminate himself and because he was ashamed that he was off getting high while he was supposed to be getting ready for his daughter's first birthday party. Strout and Peary were skeptical of Matt's tearful confession, especially after all the lies, but they agreed to check out his new alibi and see if there was any truth to it. The detectives began by pulling security camera footage from businesses along the route Matt said he took. It was a very tedious process that took 2 full days, as the detectives scrubbed hours of footage looking for Matt's white Ford Explorer. Strout's eyes were starting to glaze over when Peary suddenly grabbed his shoulder and pointed at the screen. The footage showed a familiar car traveling away from the Miller's place at 11:25 a.m. on November 28th, the morning of the murders. The detectives stared at the grainy footage, slowly realizing what this meant. The footage conclusively showed that the car's driver had lied about their alibi and had been close to the trailer around the time the crime was committed. Strout and Peary leapt into action. They sent officers out to bring that driver in for questioning. But before the arrest warrant could ever be drawn up, Peary's phone rang. He answered it, and there was a woman on the line. Peary did not recognize her voice, but she told him she had vital information about the Miller's case. For a moment, Peary was ready to write this off as just another bad tip. He and Strout had been fielding calls all week from people who claimed to recognize the mystery woman from the forensic sketch, and every one of those calls had been a dead end. But this one was different. The caller didn't mention the mystery woman at all. Instead, she said she actually knew who killed Big Mike and Val. And as the detectives listened to her story, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene, security camera footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael and Valerie Miller on the morning of November 28, 2009. Early that morning, the killer was home in their apartment, rifling through drawers in search of something, anything, that they could quickly turn into cash. They'd already pawned or sold their video game console, DVD player, and sound system, along with pretty much everything else of value. Now they were broke again and getting desperate. Suddenly, their hand closed around a metal grip. They pulled the object from the drawer, and they felt a rush of exhilaration as they stared down at the .22 caliber pistol in their hand. It wasn't what they'd initially planned to sell, but this gun could get them all the cash they needed. A few hours later, the killer was standing in the Millers' mobile home, talking to Big Mike in the kitchen. After their desperate morning search, the killer finally felt calm. Finally, the conversation with Big Mike moved past chit-chat to business. The killer pulled the pistol from their jacket and held it out, asking how much Big Mike could offer for it. The killer wasn't here to shoot Big Mike. They had come to pawn the gun. Big Mike looked the weapon over thoughtfully, then gave his answer. The killer blinked, then shrugged and nodded, feeling a bit disappointed. It was less than they had hoped for, but probably a fair offer for the tiny pistol. Big Mike handed the gun back over and said he would need to grab his business ledger from the storage room, and then he turned, but before Mike took a single step, the killer's finger brushed against the trigger. The hammer was still cocked from Big Mike's examination, and the gun went off. The killer jumped from surprise as Big Mike collapsed, his enormous body slumping to the floor of the kitchen. Val screamed and rushed into the room, instantly dropping to her husband's side. In an instant, the killer realized what they'd just done. They had shot Big Mike in the head. Maybe Val would believe this was an accident. Maybe she wouldn't. But right now, all the killer wanted was for her screaming to stop. Without really understanding why, the killer raised the gun and fired, this time on purpose. Val's scream was cut short as a bullet hit her in the head, and she collapsed onto her husband. The killer just stared down at the crumpled bodies, horrified by what they'd just done. The situation felt so unreal, but as the seconds ticked by and Big Mike and Val didn't move, the killer knew they were dead. Then, the killer realized that if they didn't want to spend the rest of their life in prison, they would need to get out of the mobile home right now. And they were about to flee when a thought suddenly struck them. They came here for money, and Big Mike would not be needing money anymore. Besides, it might be good for the killer if the police thought the shooting was part of a robbery. So, the killer ran for the storage room. They threw the door open and stood there for a moment, taking stock of the guns and electronics. The killer knew they couldn't carry very much, so they decided to take the safe. Before leaving, the killer stopped to consider Big Mike's business ledgers. They knew these books would include the sizable loans the killer had taken out from him in the past. And this made the killer nervous. So the killer quickly flipped through the pages of the ledger books until they found one containing their own name. They tucked that ledger under their arm, picked up the small but heavy safe, and left the storage room. They avoided looking at the bodies on the kitchen floor as they shuffled past, and they just continued to drag the safe out of the mobile home back to their car. Before leaving, they doubled back to lock the trailer's door. With any luck, that would delay the bodies from being discovered, and hopefully buy the killer a bit more time. A few minutes later, the killer was speeding away, and they were so focused on just getting out of town that they didn't notice the closed-circuit cameras aimed at the road. When Detective Strout and Detective Peary reviewed the camera footage 2 weeks later, they didn't see the white Ford Explorer they were looking for, because Matt Miller was not the killer. It was Nate Nightingale, the best friend of Mike Jr., who the Millers had treated almost like a third son. The woman who had called in with a hot tip was Nate's girlfriend, and she told Strout and Peary that Nate had come to her and confessed to the crime. Nate was arrested on December 12th, and shortly after that, he would admit to everything. He said he really had gone to the Miller's place intending to pawn the gun. He needed the money so he could go Christmas shopping with his girlfriend. But while he was showing the gun to Big Mike, it went off by mistake, and when he realized what he had done, he panicked and intentionally killed Val. Nate also admitted to fabricating the story about the mystery woman. He said she was just a red herring to keep the police off his tail. She didn't exist. Detective Strout and Peary didn't like to admit this, but Nate's ploy almost worked. The search for that mystery woman burned up a lot of their time, and if they hadn't stumbled upon the security camera footage of Nate's car, it might have saved him. But now that they knew the truth, they looked at the forensic illustration again, and they noticed something they hadn't before. The woman in the sketch looked shockingly similar to Nate Nightingale himself, down to the narrow face, thin nose, and glasses. Nate had intended to throw the police off his trail with this mystery woman, but as he gave them details for the sketch, he sort of subconsciously wound up describing himself. It was almost like his guilt over murdering the people who helped raise him was so great, he could not let himself get away with it. Nate was sentenced to 40 years in prison for murdering Val. Big Mike's death was treated as manslaughter, for which Nate received 15 years to be served concurrently. Big Mike and Val's sons, Mike Jr. and Matt, sat stone-faced at the sentencing, while Nate tearfully apologized for destroying their family. Neither brother responded, but they stayed and watched while he was led away in handcuffs. Ever since, the two brothers have celebrated Matt's daughter's birthday a week early so that on November 28th, they can also remember their parents. By 1993, Ludmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed. Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp, she was very motherly and tender and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Ludmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life. In the summer of 1993, Ludmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Hamar Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Ludmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child, and he looked at Ludmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students, and he would function more like an assistant to Ludmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Dennis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group up on Hamar Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Ludmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Hamar Daban mountain range. The Hamar Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation, and in the summertime, you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Ludmila and her group's multi-day hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Ludmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over this stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass, before ultimately reaching the Hamar Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Hamar Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the only group making this particular movement towards Hamar Daban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be 2 other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in. So Ludmila and her 6 students stayed the night in Merino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful, they're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely miserable. This treacherous weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro, and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this, and so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward and not play victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. They believed in Ludmila, and she's telling them to keep going, so they kept going. By the evening of August 4th, so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain where there is no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery, and she always led by example, and they saw her, right out in front leading the charge up towards the Hamar Daban Ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she turned around and told them, we're taking a break. And in fact, we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here. No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. On the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow. That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here, we'll make do. Others have said her map may not have been very accurate. And so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we got to stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realize. And she thought they can't make the 2.5 mile journey. We're going to have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal. And then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain, and so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent and soaked their sleeping bags. And they were able to go outside and they put the stakes back down on the ground, but they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But they were able to eventually fall asleep, and at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything is frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory, and if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right, they got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule, and it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the hurried mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down, it's this beautiful morning, and they're looking up at the mountains all around them. The leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head and he has to do a double take because there is this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood. And she's not doing anything, she's just standing there. And at first, he actually thought, like, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person. There's something wrong with this person. But very quickly, the group realized, like, we cannot abandon this girl. This is a young girl who should not be out here. I don't know what she's doing out here. And so they turned around and they went on shore and they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting, and they tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her, and she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that this girl needs help, and they had blankets, and so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks, and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl. She was covered in blood walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her, and although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old, her name was Valentina Yotachenko, and that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the hurried Ridge. And then she paused, and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned. Valentina goes out there and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest and we need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? And so Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up, and everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line and they start walking down the mountain. They had only made it about 10 meters into their descent when Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls. And the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time, when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth. And then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart. And then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, he's dead. The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on? Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha, and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now? And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire. And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, no, go down to the forest and start a fire. And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain, and they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, I can't move. And they turn around and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. She's heaving like something's going on inside of her, and then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha. and she dies right in front of them. And now the group is in hysterics, and Valentina's in the front and she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth, and some of them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground, just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand and she pulls her hand back. And then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode, and so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her. And he's saying, okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there. And so Valentina says, okay. She makes her way up to her bag. She gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items. And when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head. And she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone, she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain and she goes into the forest and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there and the storm picked up dramatically, and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm gonna get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids. And then she says her goodbye, and then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest, where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually she does hear voices and she starts making her way towards where they're coming from, and that's when she gets to the river and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor, as well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened, and the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. and they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision. Stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Hamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face. Either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes, not wearing jackets, not wearing pants. They're basically in underwear. And they calmly walked down the mountain all the way down to the forest. And once they got down there, two of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches. And so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all. And they were found deceased lying around this fire. The 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas. One that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche, except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened, and they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So what do you think? Is there a connection between Hamar Daban and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened to both groups that we don't know about? Or are they unrelated and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize? The next and final story of today's episode is a MrBallen fan favorite. It's called Bell's Canyon. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman, and so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down, and periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent, and this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him, and the guy's eyes go wide, and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this, and so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. Maybe he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. and there's not one. There's no fire, there's no flashlight, there is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here and, stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time he can't really just write it off. Clearly there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone, and clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, "I don't know where Bell's Canyon is." And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question, a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 a.m, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again, he didn't see him again, and he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's gonna pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. When the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. And he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do, he didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, and he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot, he got to a nearby hotel, he finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime, he was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear. And all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Where the silver winds curl through the pines, and the valley hums with forgotten lines. You walk with a lantern shaped by storms, a quiet flame in the dusk that warms. Your footsteps glow on the trembling ground, turning the night to a softer sound. Even when shadows rise like waves, you shine the path the darkness craves.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please kidnap the 5-star review button and then force them to brush their teeth with a very minty toothpaste. When they're done, make them drink a huge glass of orange juice. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs.